If you enjoy the contents of the 80 Slasher Librarian YouTube channel and would like to sponsor the channel, then see the link in the description below for the Patreon page and start enjoying the benefits of being a patron of the 80 Slasher Librarian. And enjoy tonight's narration of Final Destination, Dead Man's Hand.
But remember, the risk of cheating the plan, of disrespecting the design, could incite a fury that could terrorize even the Grim Reaper. And you don't even want to fuck with that, Mac Daddy.
Final Destination, Dead Man's Hand, Chapter 8. The dance troupe was in the midst of a complicated routine at the height of Magipalooza's climatic third act, an erotically charged battle between the forces of good and evil, when the panther got loose in the wings. It wasn't a part of the show, and it took Shauna a second to realize that the night-dark creature padding toward her was off its leash. With other costumed dancers swirling around her on stage and above her, on wires, with the orchestrated music pounding in her ears, with her focus on where her feet were supposed to be as she glided through the dance steps. To say she was otherwise preoccupied in hitting her marks and not looking backstage would be the understatement of the century. More importantly, however, was the fact that the animal's handler hadn't been immediately aware he was no longer in control. He'd glanced away just as the chain snapped to take a look at Melina, the statuesque lead nude who played an evil temptress, like he'd never seen her tits before, the asshole. The animal drew closer, and Shauna found herself on a collision course with it. It was surreal, in a way, watching the panther get low to the floor as it advanced, preparing to spring, and knowing she'd never be able to get out of its way in time. Knowing that, once it leapt at her, hundreds of pounds of killing machine would come slamming down on her, pinning her to the stage. Knowing that it would tear into her like she was a caribou, or a zebra, or whatever the fuck it was that panthers ate on those Animal Planet nature shows. Thankfully, Andy, one of the dressers who'd helped Shauna and some of the other girls change costumes between the numbers, was a little more focused, partly because he was gay and therefore had no interest in staring at Melina's boobs, but mostly because he couldn't stand the woman and the star mentality she liked to demonstrate in front of the other dancers. And since he was more concerned with making preparations for the next costume change, his eyes were on activities taking place off the stage, not on it, which is why he saw the panther break free. His cry of alarm, unheard by the audience but not by some of the dancers, alerted the stagehands and the other trainers, who sprang into action. The animal was quickly corralled before it got past the edge of the curtain, and taken away without any trouble. Maybe because it was well trained and was used to obeying its handlers. Maybe because it didn't feel like fighting. Or maybe it just had other plans. Because Shauna could swear that, as it was led away, the panther looked right at her, and licked its chops as if to say, "See you around, meat." By the time she got backstage, Shauna was a nervous wreck. She'd done her best to remain calm and avoid freaking out. The show must go on, after all, but now that she was out of sight of the audience, she was suddenly hit with a really bad case of the shakes. Andy came hurrying over to her while his partner Eric worked with the other dressers to help the girls into the vibrantly colored Firebird costumes they wore in the big finale. "Shauna, come on," Andy prodded. "You have to get ready for the next number." Shauna shook her head. "I can't," she muttered hoarsely. He placed a gentle arm around her shoulders, then briskly rubbed his hand up and down her right arm to counteract her chills. "Of course you can. You have to. The show—" "Don't say it," she cut in, willing her teeth to chatter. "Please." 2 minutes, the stage manager called out. He looked over from his station near the curtain. "She gonna be all right?" he asked Andy. "She's fine," the dresser assured him. He gave Shauna a comforting squeeze. "Come on, honey. That nasty old pussy's not here to frighten you any more. But if we do see Dory coming back, we'll be sure to give you ample warning, okay?" Shauna laughed in spite of her shivering. She couldn't help it, given the odd way Andy spoke that always made her giggle. His use of the imperial we instead of I, when referring to himself, like he was British royalty or something. Where he might have picked that up, she hadn't a clue, especially since Andy's roots were in a dairy farming family in Wisconsin, and she'd never really bothered to ask. "There you go," Andy said happily, giving her a brief hug. "Now that's the Shauna we know and love." He winked. "Ready to get back to work?" "Yeah, I guess so," she replied. "Good!" He gestured for Eric to come over with her costume. "Because I'm not about to squeeze into that god-awful thing and be your stand-in. I don't have the hips for it." "That's not what I've heard," Shauna said playfully. Andy didn't respond, though. Now that he'd talked her down off the ledge, metaphorically speaking, he was all business. He and Eric moved quickly, detaching Shauna from all the feathers and rhinestones. For about 2 seconds she had the wonderful sensation of the terrible weight being lifted from her shoulders, only to have another take its place. She groaned as the Firebird costume was hooked on to the harness-like backpack attached to her bra. Unlike the battle scene costume, this particular feather assembly didn't have the benefit of padding, so the wing braces dug heavily into the back of her neck. 30 seconds! The stage manager bellowed. Eric placed an intricate headdress, the flames of the Firebird, on top of the stocking cap Shauna wore over her hair, and tightened the Velcro straps in the back. Then he clipped on a few hairpins for good measure. It wouldn't do to have the thing fall off as she danced across the stage. For the minute that it had taken to go through her clothing switch, Shauna had forgotten all about the panther. But as she prepared to step back out on the stage with the other girls, she caught sight of the cat being led around the stage by Uriel Mayo, the part of the show where his character, Palin, proved he was master of all beasts. Shauna cautiously moved past the cat, trying to concentrate on her own steps. It was difficult, though. She could feel the panther watching her the whole time. At least she thought it was watching her. That set all sorts of warning bells off in her head. What if the cat, even now, was straining to reach her, trying to break another leash so it could pick up where it had left off? Shauna wished she could turn around to find out, but she had to keep moving, had to finish the routine. The show must go on after all, and it would go on somehow, some way, even if one of its entertainers got turned into hamburger helper in some bizarre mishap. Ah, showbiz. God, Shauna thought miserably. Sometimes I really hate this fucking job, Warren said as he gripped the steering wheel. He let his skull drop back against the padded headrest and released a disgusted sigh through clenched teeth. He and Izzy had spent the balance of the day visiting Roberto Diaz's usual haunts, but the only ghost they found either denied knowing who Diaz was, an especially annoying circumstance when one of the people they interviewed was their suspect's cousin, or were nowhere to be found, probably off scaring the clientele at a liquor store or a crack house, just for a change of pace. Homicide had issued a press release to the media around 3 o'clock, asking the public for any information that could lead them to the elusive Roberto Diaz, and stressing that the man was merely a person of interest. In post-9/11 America, the phrase, appropriated from Homeland Security terminology by practically every law enforcement agency in the country, was meant to convey Metro's belief that they considered Diaz a possible witness to Danny Riva's killing, and not the actual murderer. As far as Warren was concerned, it just meant they didn't want to spook the son of a bitch and have him hightail it out of the city, if he hadn't already. With every passing hour, however, the trail was growing colder, and the chance Diaz might have set off for the California border was becoming a very real prospect. The traffic light changed, and Warren turned the car around the corner of Stewart Avenue and into the parking area outside downtown Area Command. He killed the engine and let his hands fall into his lap. In the passenger seat beside him, Izzy closed her notepad and tucked it away in the inside breast pocket of her blazer. "So, still thinking about retirement?" He turned, a mirthless smile in her direction. "After today? Oh yeah." He paused, letting the smile fade. "But not until we've cleared this one." Izzy nodded, apparently pleased with his answer. "Still think Diaz is in the city?" "God, I hope so," Warren replied, then shrugged. "But I'm starting to doubt it, you know." I'm really starting to doubt it. Well, we know he isn't using the busted-up piece of shit Firebird he owns to get anywhere, Izzy pointed out. Not after those 2 uniforms found it over by the Econo Lodge on Charleston. The report on that had come in around 7 o'clock, but a quick sweep of the hotel by a handful of other officers, led by Warren and Isabel, had turned up nothing. Yeah, Warren admitted, but Diaz could have doubled back to the bus station or boosted another ride. Or he could still be somewhere in the vicinity, Izzy said with a knowing smile. There was a sort of cheerleader and a pep rally tone in her voice. She probably put it on in an attempt to bolster her partner's confidence, but it was going to take a lot more than a cheery voice and a good thought to accomplish that. The look on his face apparently made that clear to her, because her smile reversed direction. "What? It's within the realm of possibility, isn't it?" she asked. He thought about it for a second, then nodded. "Yeah, I guess. Doesn't make it so, though." "Man, you really do hate the job, don't you?" Izzy said. She sounded surprised. "I thought maybe you were just going through a phase or something, like we all go through at some point. I figured you'd get over it by the end of the day." She leaned across the seat to stare deep into his eyes as cars drove by. "But I can see now that ain't gonna happen." She sat back and shook her head. "You're way past depression. You're really burned out." "To a fucking crisp," Warren agreed. He opened his door to step out of the car. "But that doesn't mean I'm not going to do my job and put away the sick fucks who killed that kid before I call it quits. And if it turns out Diaz is the one who did it, or he's helping whoever did do it get out of town, I'm going to bury my foot so far up his ass when I find him, the EMTs will think he ate a size 11 for lunch." A stern look darkened Isabel's features. "I didn't hear that, Warren," she said. "He's a suspect. You don't get to beat the shit out of suspects just 'cause they piss you off." She pointed a warning finger at him. "You try using excessive force on Diaz when we locate him, without clear provocation, and the press will have a field day, and I'll have to admit to Internal Affairs that we had this conversation." He tried to give her a friendly thanks for the reminder smile, but his facial muscles wound up turning it into a smirk. "You take all the fun out of police work, you know that." He pulled himself out of the car and slammed the door before she could reply. As Warren headed across the parking lot toward his own car, a black 1994 Dodge Intrepid, whose dings and dents and scratched paint job showed its 10-plus years of service, Izzy got out of the plainclothes unit and walked up to join him. "You heading over to the tower?" she asked. Warren looked at his watch. It was just past 9 o'clock. "Not just yet. Shauna doesn't get off work till 11. Figured I'd head home, take a quick shower, and change. Why? You want to grab a beer or something?" "Maybe tomorrow," she replied. "No, I was just asking." He stopped beside the driver's side of the Intrepid, paused a moment, then turned around to look at her suspiciously. "Oh, I get it. You think I'm so fed up with the job that maybe I'll go home and eat my gun?" He grinned. She shook her head. "No, you're not that stupid. And as long as you've got a woman like Shauna in your life, you're not about to throw that away, just because you're starting to hate what you do." She waved her hands, gesturing at the world in general. "Christ, if everybody who hated their jobs felt like killing themselves, you could probably fill up the Grand Canyon with the bodies." "Then why the interest?" Warren asked. "Because I want to know if you're going to tell Shauna how you feel," Izzy replied. "It's one thing to pour your heart out to your partner." "Is that what I was doing?" Warren quipped. "Guess I gotta stop watching Oprah when I'm off duty. It's making me too chatty." "But," Izzy continued, adopting a stern tone, "I'm not your girlfriend, and she's the one you really ought to be telling your problems to." She gently placed a hand on his arm. "You know I'm always willing to listen, Wren, but it's not fair to Shauna if you keep shutting her out." He shifted uncomfortably from one foot to the other and scratched the back of his neck. "Yeah, I know. But I just don't like burdening her with that shit, you know?" "Shauna's a big girl, Warren," Izzy replied. "She knows the world is sometimes a scary place. She used to dance at this end of town, remember? I think she can handle whatever you tell her. I think she wants to handle whatever you tell her, if you'll give her the chance." She smiled. "It's not like you're gonna quote her chapter and verse from ME reports, right? Even I wouldn't tell that stuff to Charlie." She gave his arm a small squeeze. Think about it, okay? It's not like she's asking you to marry her. She just wants to be part of the other half of your life, even as bad as it can be. Warren slowly nodded. Okay, he smiled. Thanks, Oprah. I'll let you know how it turns out. Just talk to her, Wren. It'll do both of you a world of good. Izzy grinned and lightly punched him on the shoulder. I'll see you tomorrow. She turned and began walking toward her SUV on the far side of the lot. Tell Charlie I said hi, Warren called after her. She looked back as she kept walking. I'll be sure to give him a big kiss for you, okay, Warren? Warren held up a warning finger. Just on the cheek, he joked. And tell him it doesn't mean anything, not unless he wants to buy me dinner. Izzy laughed and waved goodbye, then headed off to her vehicle. Warren climbed inside the Intrepid and keyed the engine. He spared a glance in the rearview mirror to see Izzy get into the SUV, just to make sure she wasn't watching to see if he really was contemplating suicide, then drove out of the lot. It was nice and all that Izzy was so concerned about his well-being, but she didn't need to worry. After all, she was right about Shauna and him. With her in his life, he had too much to live for. With all the shit he had to wade through on a daily basis, she was the one thing he had to look forward to when his shift was over. Eat his gun? No fucking way. He'd sooner quit the force and whore himself out at the chicken ranch than blow his brains out. No, he had better things to do with his time, like maybe taking Shauna out to a late dinner tonight, and finally opening up to her. Scratch that, he thought. There was no maybes about it. Izzy was right about that, too. Shauna could make her own choices. If she didn't want to hear about the crap he had to deal with, that was fine. But it would have to be her decision. Warren smiled. It was the oddest sensation, but it felt like a weight was starting to lift from his shoulders. All this time keeping Shauna at arm's length when it came to his work, mistakenly trying to protect a grown, intelligent woman from the darkness of the world he inhabited. It seemed so incredibly stupid on his part. Well-intentioned, but nonetheless stupid. Now that Izzy had made him take a step back, he was able to get a good look at the big picture, and realize that maybe all this time he had been a selfish fuck, as his partner had so eloquently put it this afternoon. Well, all of that's gonna change, he promised himself. After tonight, the bond between him and Shauna was going to be different, was going to be stronger. A fresh start, a new direction to their relationship, from which they'd share equally in the good times as well as the bad. No holding back, no secrets, no bullshitting. Yes, indeed, tonight was going to be the night when he finally set things right, Warren thought with a broad smile. A regular night to remember, guaranteed to change their lives forever. Chapter 9. Get enough sleep there, Grandpa? Allie asked and smiled broadly. A hint of blush colored Tom's cheeks, and he shrugged. Yeah, I guess. Didn't think I was getting so old already I'd start dozing off in the middle of the day. Allie raised an eyebrow. Dozing? You were out for like 4 hours. Again a shrug. Yeah, okay, but all that walking can really wipe you out, you know. This isn't the kind of town made for getting around on foot. He wagged his index finger at her. Besides, who was it I found sacked out next to me when I woke up? Jude Law? She quipped, then paused. Oh no, wait. That was my fantasy. Yours is the one with girls wearing tinfoil. She did a little wave of her hand to cut him off before he could protest. Anyway, I'm entitled to my beauty sleep. That's what keeps me looking so fresh and girly. She gave him a wide-eyed grin. Girly, huh? Tom said wryly. Don't know what's so girly about snoring. That's 'cause you're not a girly, Allie replied, still grinning. A little smile pulled at the left corner of Tom's mouth. Well, I do like to think of myself as a lesbian trapped in a man's body, he said quietly. Ick, Allie said, sticking out her tongue in distaste. Hey, don't knock it till you've tried it, sister, Tom answered. Allie frowned. Do you ever want to get laid again? By you? He asked. Or just in general? Yes, by me, she answered a little snappishly. "Yes," Tom said slowly. It was clear he didn't know where this was going. "Then don't ever bring that up again," she warned. "I have enough problems in my life, all right? I don't need to add them with a mental image of getting screwed by a hermaphrodite every time we're doing it. Thank you very much." She tapped the sides of her head with her knuckles and groaned slightly. "See, now it's stuck in there." "Best of both worlds, you know," Tom said offhandedly. From what I've heard," he added quickly. "Knock it off," Allie said sternly, emphasizing each word. "Or the only world you're going to get to know for the rest of this trip is one of extreme sexual loneliness." He waved a hand in a dismissive gesture. "Puh! Been there, done that. That's why God gave us 2 hands and an imagination, and loads of internet porn." Allie gnashed her teeth in frustration, but Tom only smiled in response. "Eat," he said pleasantly. "Your food's getting cold." Allie looked down at her plate. She had ordered the sweet potato catfish. Like most food associated with New Orleans, it was heavy on the spices. The sauce even had a slight flavor of bourbon. Her tongue had started burning and her eyes started watering after the first 2 bites. But the beer she was having with it, a Kingfisher brewed in India, not her normal Budweiser or Rolling Rock, but why not try something different in a fancy restaurant, did wonders for cooling down the initial sting. She wasn't as much in the mood to eat as she had been when they were taking the elevator up to the Lady of the Lake. It didn't seem to have affected Tom, though. He'd ordered the poached salmon with dilled sour cream and gone back to tearing into it, and the fresh-baked miniature dinner rolls that came with every meal, with a great deal of gusto. He'd taken a few large bites, then wash it down with gulps of his typical drink of choice, a Corona served in a tall glass. A small touch of geniality to ensure the clientele knew they were eating in a restaurant, and not some greasy hamburger joint in a shopping mall. Allie turned her attention away from the food to look around at the Lady of the Lake. Even at 1 o'clock in the morning it was fairly packed. She and Tom had to wait 15 minutes for a table to free up when they'd first arrived. A lot of it probably had to do with the nighttime view. From there you could see the entire city and well beyond. And since the restaurant was the highest point in town, the light pollution, that glaring byproduct of artificial lighting, which obscured the majority of the stars filling the sky and found in major cities like Vegas, wasn't even a factor. With the neon signs of the Strip so far below, and the restaurant's lighting kept to a dim, romantic level, to Allie it was as though the lady was floating in space. The stars around it were in such abundance. A few tables away she spotted a couple huddled close together. She might have considered them father and daughter. The guy certainly looked old enough, but from the way they were holding hands it was pretty clear they were anything but. Although in this town anything was possible. It was called Sin City, right? The girl, a brunette, with the kind of figure Allie hated, because women like that never gained an ounce of fat, no matter what they ate, looked a little shaken, like something traumatic had happened. Maybe he was breaking up with her? Allie didn't think that all too surprising. She'd had her share of romantically set, expensive meals in her time, a majority of which ended with the jerk muttering how they should maybe see other people, and her getting stuck with the check as a going-away present. A little something to remember him by when her visa bill came in at the end of the month. The guy appeared to be no different. His body language, from the way he sat hunched over in his chair to the awkward way he grabbed her hand, screamed tough guy to Allie. And tough guys usually weren't that romantic. She could attest to that fact as well. And with someone who looked like that tough in a town like Las Vegas, well, the first thing that came to Allie's mind was that the guy was probably a mobster. Did the mafia run all the casinos, she wondered? She'd heard that somewhere once, maybe in a movie. No, more likely in one of those documentaries about the town she caught on A&E. Or was it the History Channel? Whatever, the guy looked like a thug, right down to his cheap suit. Weren't mobsters supposed to dress better than in off-the-rack shit? And no doubt he was telling the girl how it was really better for both of them if they called it quits. Translation, he was already screwing somebody else and was looking to discard his old toy in a public setting as possible so she wouldn't make a scene. Or he just needed a room full of witnesses who could attest to his gentlemanly behavior tonight if she ever turned up missing. Allie shuddered slightly at the thought and turned her gaze elsewhere. She focused on the decor of the restaurant, admiring the fact that it was so tasteful and glamorous and quiet, as opposed to the blaringly gaudy, in-your-face King Arthur motif created by the designers of the hotel casino directly beneath her feet. Up here there were no serving wenches wearing corsets that pushed out their boobs, no strolling minstrels with jingly bell caps trying to interrupt your meal with lame songs about brave knights dining with their virtuous maidens. That was a laugh on both counts. No pre-recorded, tiny Renaissance festival music croaking out of speakers set in the ceiling. No, the Lady of the Lake, despite its Arthurian name, was a real restaurant. Good food, if a little pricey, well-dressed serving staff, and a three-piece jazz band, pianist, guitarist, and drummer, quietly performing some old standards. Yes, just as the hotel brochure had promised, it truly was a perfect setting for a romantic dinner for two. Or the perfect place to finally sit down and get to the business at hand. "So this marriage thing," she began slowly as she turned back to face Tom. "Yes?" She noticed how his shoulders tensed, like he was waiting for the proverbial hammer to fall. The expression on his face, however, told a different story. He'd been waiting for her to start the discussion, and now was grateful she had. That was so typically Tom, not wanting to be the first to bring up bad news, usually waiting for the other person to do it. In a way, it was sort of amusing. The great avoider counting on the queen of procrastination to open the floor for debate. "Well?" She glanced away to stare down at her food. As it cooled, the sweet potato-encrusted catfish, lying there in its red-tinged sauce, was starting to look like a hardening scab, the spinach underneath it a little green pus oozing out from its edges. The sight of it immediately made Allie turn her attention back to Tom. "So, how's the first day been? It's working out for you? Getting used to the whole husband angle?" "Sure," he replied. His eyes narrowed in suspicion. "How come you're asking? Are you having second thoughts?" Third or fourth thoughts, actually, Allie considered to herself. But she had also come to realize that the pressure she'd been feeling when she woke up, the little voice in her head that screamed, "How could you be so fucking stupid as to get married to your ex-boyfriend of all people, you dumbass?" had begun to ease as the day progressed. Could be because that old woman Ethel telling them off this morning in the lobby about how they needed to make the most of it if they wanted the marriage to work. It had in Allie's case. Okay, so maybe playing tourist and going on a shopping spree for souvenirs wasn't exactly making the most of it. But it had been a start, right? Baby steps. That's what they'd been taking. Slow, careful steps to make sure neither of them fell flat on their face, or went banging their head on the unpadded corners of the psychological furniture around them. "What, you're rethinking it right now?" Tom asked, disrupting her little digression. Allie shook her head. "No, I just wanted to make sure you weren't." His face contorted, as though in a brief show of pain, and then it became his turn to stare at his plate. "Well, I'd be lying if I hadn't thought about it," he muttered. Allie's eyebrows rose. An admission like that was a big step for Tom, the kind of thing he never would have done back when they were dating. In those days, he would have taken the macho guy approach and tried bullshitting her about how he'd never doubted their decision for a minute. That he was hitting her with the truth so early into this marriage was a bigger shock than the knowledge he'd been reconsidering their situation. But not almost as big a shock as the realization that now she was the one doing the bullshitting. Holy role reversals, Batman, she thought. He looked up at her. "Big surprise, huh? I mean, me coming right out and admitting it?" She nodded lamely. "Well, yeah, you could say that." He smiled. "You think maybe getting married, maybe me being a married man is getting me to open up, get in touch with my feelings and shit like that?" "Well, when you put it that way," Allie replied wryly, "maybe not so much. But I have to admit it's a start." Tom nodded, like he was pleased with her answer, and with himself. Maybe he and his ego would like to be alone, she thought. She used her napkin to hide the smile now pulling at her lips. "What about you?" he asked. Inwardly, she grimaced. She really should have seen this one coming. "What about me what?" she asked coyly. "You know," he replied. "Getting used to the wife thing yet?" She took a sip of Kingfisher to stall for time while she formulated an answer. "It's not so bad," she finally said. "But we're only starting out. We've still got a couple of days left to see what happens." She put down her glass and leaned forward to put her hand over his. "I mean, this is a big life-changing thing we're doing, Tom. If we're really going to commit to the whole man and wife, till death do us part thing, we've got to be sure it's the right thing for us. We're talking about the rest of our lives, after all. You understand that, right?" He nodded somberly, but he didn't look as upset about her point of view as he had been that morning. Like he'd resigned himself to the way events would ultimately play out, no matter how unpleasant that might be for the both of them. But really, who said they had to turn out badly? "So what do you want to do on this improvised honeymoon?" she asked. "Want to take that ride over to Barstow tomorrow?" She paused for dramatic effect. "And then maybe we'll check out that Star Trek show after dinner, if we're not too wiped out from the driving." He was like a little kid. His eyes got so big and bright. "For real?" "For real. But you can do most of the driving," she replied. "I'll play navigator, 'cause you know how much you suck when it comes to reading maps." He cocked his head to one side, looking idiotically confused. "Why do we need a map to drive to Barstow? I thought you said it was just over the border." "Uh-huh. And the exact location of that border would be where?" she asked. He shrugged. "Beats me. I've never been to California, remember?" "Yeah, I know. And we need a map because you have that—" She grabbed his hand and pulled him toward her. "That affliction," she whispered. The look of confusion turned to one of annoyance. "What affliction?" "You know the one," she replied. "It's called narcissus mapulitis. A terrifying fear of asking for directions because you're afraid of bruising your male ego." She patted his hand, grinned, and sat back. "Don't feel like you're alone, honey. According to a study I saw in Time magazine, just about every guy suffers from it at some point in their life. But I hear they're working on a cure." "Smart ass," he mumbled. "And getting smarter every day beats being a dumbass," she replied. "I read a lot, you know, and I'm not talking just about the comic strips in the newspapers." "Uh-huh," Tom said, and picked up his glass of Corona. "And you're telling me this why?" "Well, I don't want you thinking you were getting some kind of trophy wife as part of the deal," she replied with a smile. "I might be a hot-looking chick and all, but there's a brain under all this hair, and I'm not afraid to use it." "You've never been afraid to use it before," he countered. "Why start now?" He winked, then took a swig of beer. A whimsical little smile tugged at the corners of his mouth as he swallowed. "Besides," he added in what sounded like a sincere tone, "I wouldn't have you act any other way." She chuckled. "Oh, you're a smooth talker when you want to be, Tom Gaines. You know that?" "Only 'cause I want to get laid tonight," he replied with a broad grin. "Well, that'd be up to me now, wouldn't it?" Allie asserted with a sly smile. "Maybe the machine would like a night off." His face went 3 shades of red in the space of a heartbeat. "Oh, shit," he croaked out. The sly smile on Allie's face morphed into a Cheshire cat-like grin. "Let's see how smooth a talker he is now," she thought, with some measure of sadistic glee. One thing was for certain. She wasn't going to get stuck with the bill for this mill. Sitting at the elegant, smoke-dark oak bar at the other side of the dining area, Arlen Plug looked at the bill in front of him and wondered just what had possessed him to have dinner in such a fancy restaurant. Normally, he'd be seated at one of the banquet tables at the tower's downstairs buffet, but he'd suddenly got it in his head to make a detour, up to the top of the world, as it were. Maybe he was in a mood to see how the other half lived. Maybe he was in a mood to celebrate coming out a winner against the Grim Reaper this afternoon at the laundromat, when that human wrecking machine had decided not to pound him into dust. Or maybe he was just sick of the cheap steak and instant mashed potatoes the common folk, like him, were served at the round table in exchange for all the cash they poured into the casino. Motivations aside, he had to admit the place was awfully nice. Just sitting here made him feel like a big shot. Still, in this town, the chance to feel important often came with a hefty price, and the Lady of the Lake was not an eatery for the faint of wallet. That's why Arlen had almost choked on his apple martini when the bartender slid the bill in front of him. $40 for 3 drinks? $25 for a bowl of New England-style clam chowder? Sure, the clams might be fresh and they served it with those little oyster-shaped crackers, but Jesus, that was some expensive soup. What'd they do, fly to Boston to catch the little fuckers themselves, then ship them cross-country? Arlen sighed quietly. It looked like he'd be stopping off at the supermarket on his way home later to stock up on more ramen noodles. Between this dinner and the run he'd been making at the poker tables, in a little while, he'd be eating them for the next few weeks after the battering his bank account was about to take. Well, try and look on the bright side, he told himself. At least you did this before you started playing cards, so you actually have some dough to pay for it. And it's a good thing, too. From the way the manager was giving you the hard stare when you walked in, odds are 6, 2, and even he'd call in some of his boys if you came up light. Fucking mobsters. Will there be anything else? The bartender asked. She was a bottle redhead. No natural hair color he knew of ever came in that kind of fire engine hue, with a face like a porn star and a chest to match. The white blouse and tight black vest she wore over it helped accentuate her curves. It was a far cry from the grizzled old-timers working the counters downtown, with their bulbous red noses lit up like Rudolph himself, and their beer guts flowing over their belt buckles like yeast rising out of a baking pan. But that was all a part of the appeal of the tower's snazzy restaurant. Not only were the people who ate here beautiful, but so were the folks who served them. This one had introduced herself as Leah when he took a seat at the bar, the only place in the restaurant for singles like him to sit. But dealing with her was strictly on a business level. He could tell that right off the bat. Unlike the bartenders downtown, who at least pretended to care when you started telling them your troubles, if only to keep you drinking, Leah was apparently not the least bit interested in hearing them, if he'd been so inclined to start pouring out his heart to a perfect stranger. She'd put a menu in front of him, told him to let her know when he was ready to order, and moved off to take care of another customer. A better-looking male customer, Arlen noticed. Yeah, well, like that was a big surprise. Now she was back at the end of his meal, showing him only as much interest as her job required. Probably wanted him to hurry up and get the hell away from her bar, so some male model type could have a seat. Just pay the bill and get out, her expression seemed to tell him. You're lowering our level of fashionability every second your ass is on that stool. Well, screw that, he thought. He was the customer, wasn't he? He'd be the one who decided when he was ready to leave. You know what? Yeah, Arlen replied. I'll have a coffee. There was a momentary flash of heat in those baby blue eyes. Was she wearing colored contacts? Latte, cappuccino, espresso? Just a regular coffee, Arlen said, putting on his sweetest smile. Black, no sugar. She picked up the bill, a small frown dimpling her cheeks. Not too deeply, he noticed. She probably got some kind of Botox injection during the week to smooth out her laugh lines. Be up in a minute, she muttered, then walked away. Thanks, he said pleasantly. If she heard him, she did not acknowledge it. Arlen leaned back in the high-backed stool, feeling like he'd made some small victory in the internal class war between the average Joe and the, what did the tabloids call them? Fashionistas? A fancy word for a high-priced shithead when this town was all about labels. Nobody just called a spade anymore. Well, he'd get his shots in where he could, even if it meant giving a snooty bartender a little grief. It wasn't as though he expected to ever set foot in this joint again. His wallet wouldn't be able to take another hit like that. He looked over his shoulder to scope out the rest of the place. From what he could see, the crowd was a mix of trendy young hipsters with their dates, and folks in their 40s and 50s. There were a few senior citizens scattered around, more than likely just to show the restaurant didn't discriminate against AARP members. Arlen wondered how much they lowered the level of fashionability. Probably not too much, since they were tucked away in one of the darker spots, away from the windows. Like anyone from the street could see up 120 stories and go, "Old people! Shit! We're not eating up there!" There was a loud clink of china behind him, and Arlen turned back around. Leah had returned, and none too quietly placed a cup of coffee on the counter in front of him. She stood there silently, leaning against the bar with both hands, like she was waiting for him to ask for the dessert menu and prolong her misery. "Thanks, sweetheart," Arlen said, with his friendliest smile. "You're a real pal." She rolled her eyes and grunted in disgust, then slapped the revised bill on the bar. "Let me know when you're ready to pay," she said, and walked off. Arlen picked up the cup with both hands and held it under his nose. The aroma was incredible. He could swear there was the slightest hint of chocolate in the brew. This sure as hell wasn't some store-bought instant crap. This was the good stuff. He took a sip and swished it around in his mouth for a couple of moments, savoring the taste. As he glanced down at the bill, he realized he had to enjoy it while it lasted. At $5 a cup, he wouldn't be drinking any more of it in this lifetime. He took another sip and closed his eyes. Yeah, there was chocolate in there, all right, just enough to cut down some of the bean's bitter taste. Throwing in milk and sugar would have killed the flavor and the caffeine buzz he was going to need when he dropped by the poker tables in a few minutes. Arlen opened his eyes and placed the cup back on its saucer. Just to his right was one of the big picture windows, and through it he could see the south end of Las Vegas Boulevard, where all the big casinos laid out like gaudy souvenirs from a giant's trip around the world. A bit of France, a bit of New York, a taste of Egypt, a couple pirate ships, even a volcano. All it needed was a big dome covering everything and a bunch of fake plastic snow to swirl around. And then he caught sight of his reflection on the glass, like he'd been superimposed over the image of this neon-lit testament to wealth and excess. Like he was the guy who owned this town, who called the shots, who had every high-priced roller, every showgirl, every big-name star who blew in from L.A. begging for his attention. "Top of the world, Ma," he said softly as he saluted the mirror plug. "Top of the world." Of course, things hadn't worked out too well for Jimmy Cagney when he'd screamed out those words in that 40s gangster movie White Heat. Didn't the building he was in blow up just after he said them? But it somehow seemed appropriate. Shit, it wasn't as if Arlen was about to throw his arms up over his head and start yelling, "I'm king of the world!" What was that supposed to mean, anyway? The boat sank and the poor bastard drowned at the end of the movie, didn't he? That wasn't going out in style. That wasn't being on top of your game. But Cagney buying the farm and an exploding chemical plant? That was all style, baby, even if he was playing a psycho killer. So yeah, for one night at least, Arlen Plug was on top of the world. It was a feeling that wouldn't last for very long, not once he got back on the elevator to head down to the lobby. But for the time being, he was going to drink his coffee and admire the view, and the fashionistas could go screw for all he cared. What was the point in rushing anyway? The casino would still be there when he left the restaurants. The dealers would still be ready to take his money whenever he showed up, and the great glass elevator would still come all the way up here to get him when he pressed the call button. To paraphrase his mother, when he was living back home in New Jersey and had to grab the PATH train every day to go into Manhattan, "There'll always be another elevator. You don't have to kill yourself racing to catch the first one." In elevators, as in subway trains, it was sound advice, even 20 years later. Arlen nodded in agreement with that bit of logic, and then took another sip of his coffee. Okay, Slashaholics, this has been chapters 8 and 9 of Final Destination Dead Man's Hand. And with that little more backstory in, we're at the top of this tower, and man, they keep mentioning that elevator over and over again. And as of right now, we've got Arlen there, we've got Allie, and we've got Tom. All we need is Shauna and Warren, right? And we've got the full party ready to go. I have a feeling the next upload is going to be the premonition. I feel like we're about to kick into high gear in this book. I'm looking forward to it, guys. Can't wait. I'll be back very soon. And hopefully when I'm back, things are going to start to pick up. Before I go, I want to say thank you to our patrons over on the Patreon page. Carl Eakins, Catherine McClear, Sean Campbell, and our newest one, our $15 a month slasher in training, Cecilia Sparks. Thank you guys so much for all your love and support of the channel and sponsoring to help keep this channel going. And if anybody else would like to sponsor the channel and get some great perks for doing so, then check out the link in the description below to the Patreon page. And until next time, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying, thanks for listening, and